Hi, my name is Aya. You're watching Aya Reads, and I have been reading Sarah J. Maas for 10 years. That is ridiculous. I cannot believe how fast time has flown. Basically, this video is me just gushing about her books and when I read them, how long it took me to read them. And also, since I started my booktube channel at the end of 2014, I'm gonna insert clips of me talking about these books while I was reading them. Since there were times I took breaks from my channel, I cannot do that for every single book, but I do believe most of these books have been featured on my channel. In fact, only the first 3 books I read before starting my channel, and even then, I'm pretty sure they made an appearance in my favorite books of that year. So that is exciting as well. Yeah, I'm just gonna insert clips here of past Aya talking about these books. Yes, was there anything else? Yeah, at the end, I'm gonna talk to you about a book that I have not read yet. Also, my favorite series, my favorite book. Although, if you've watched me for a while, you already know the answer to that. Yeah, Sarah J. Maas, say what you want about her. She has brought so much joy to my life. In this decade that I talk about, there have been some very, very dark times. And in those times, her books were one of the few things that did keep me going and that did bring some joy to my life. So for that, I'll just always be thankful. And her books are I just always love them. Like I think I've only given one book by her 4 stars and the other ones have all been 5 stars. It just brings me so much happiness and joy. So actually, since, like I said, I started reading her in 2014. Her first book came out in 2012. So I started reading her 2 years after her first book came out. So I've been one of her first supporters. On the one hand, I am very happy that a lot of people seem to love her books like I do, but obviously getting bigger does have its downsides. If your fan base gets bigger, obviously that also has its downsides, especially with like the recent controversy about the Fairy Loot editions. Having said all that, this is a positive video because, like I said, she has brought me so much joy and her books have brought me so much joy in this decade that I'm going to talk about. And this is also going to be like a reflection of my 10 years on BookTube because that is like at the end of the year, I have been on BookTube for 10 years. So let's just get started. When I started reading her, the only series that was out was the Throne of Glass series. In fact, only the first 3 books of that series were out. So every other book I've read around the time it came out. So that is also fun for me. Also, what is funny about Sarah J. Maas books is, especially in the beginning, it took me months and months to get through her books. A part of that is probably because I was still in school and I had other things going on and I didn't have a whole lot of free time. So this week's topic was the books that took you the longest to finish. Sometimes it just takes me really long to finish books for some reason. And it doesn't always have to do anything with the books because most of these books I actually really enjoy. Next is actually an author, and you may guess who. I really don't know what it is about her, but her books always take me very long to finish, and it's Sarah J. Maas. Part of me is thinking it's taking me so long to finish because I love her books so much that I'm kind of savoring them, so really taking my time with them. But on the other hand, sometimes I time myself to see how fast I'm reading a book, so how many pages can I read in 30 minutes. And I do, like her books, even if I push myself to read fast, her books take me the longest to finish for some reason. I can't guess why. It's because, especially the hardbacks, they're really big and therefore a page takes longer to finish. Plus, I don't know what it's about her writing style, but it makes me read the book very slowly. And 2 examples I have of that is A Court of Mist and Fury and Queen of Shadows. So these are 2 different series and both of them took me very long to finish. Court of Mist and Fury took me 2 months and The Queen of Shadows took me 3 months, and I'm actually currently reading Empire of Storms, and I got that book on the day of release and I still haven't finished it. I'm about halfway through, and on the one hand I would like to finish them really quickly because then I can, you know, talk about my feelings very quickly, I can have my review up very quickly. But on the other hand, since I love the book so much, part of me doesn't really mind that it's taking me so long to finish because I can enjoy them for longer. And another fun fact, which we'll get to that towards the end, is somehow, especially with her latest releases, I have been in book slumps while her books were releasing. So like, even though with some of the books, I read it when they came out and it just took me 2 days to read. Other times, it either took me months and months to finish, or it took me months or years to finally get to a book because I was in a reading slump. So that is, like I said, I'm gonna go more in depth when I get to those books, but that is just funny. Like, her books, the way I've read them has really evolved and changed, and I've run the gambit. It's not like, for example, Elsie Silver now, I tend to read her books very fast, and it just takes me a couple days to finish it. And that is very consistent. Whereas with Sarah J Maas, it's not. A part of that is probably because I have been reading her for 10 years. And it is like, I started reading her when I was 20 and now I'm 30. So obviously a lot happens in that decade. The first book, of course, was Throne of Glass. I remember, so like I said, it came out in 2012. And in those 2 years, a lot of people really talked about this book. But I remember one person who constantly kept recommending it was Reagan over at Peruse Project, which is funny because I don't think she's a big fan of Sarah J Maas right now, but she is one of the reasons why I started reading her. So in 2014, I actually read 3 books by her, and it was the 3 books that were out so far. So of course, Throne of Glass. I started this on February 16th of 2014, and I finished it on April 20th of 2014. So it took me 2 months to read, but I did love it. I actually started, so I have the original US hardbacks. When I first read it, I actually read them in the UK paperbacks, and ever since then I've given those books away. A part of me is sad about that, but it was a good decision to pick up the hardbacks because the paperbacks got ruined so fast because they were white. Yeah, these just stand the test of time more. So yeah, Throne of Glass. Then of course I read Crown of Midnight. And I read this one way faster, even though this is not one of my favorites by her. I started this on August 14th of 2014, and I finished it on August 20th of 2014. And then one of my favorite books by her actually is The Assassin's Blade, which I actually started on my birthday on August 22nd of 2014, and I finished it on September 7th of 2014. So these books were the books I read in 2014. I would say you can read them the way I read them, because I believe that is one of the reading orders. Read the first 2 and then get on with Assassin's Blade. Although I do have to say, now every time I do a reread, I always start with the Assassin's Blade first, because that is the chronological way. I'm here to do my top 14 favorite books of 2014, the Throne of Glass series by Sarah J Maas. So I've only read these 2 and the Assassin's Blade, which I couldn't find, so I'm just holding these 2 up. Oh my god, I love these so much. So I also have the 3rd book, but for some reason I just didn't get around to it. I will most definitely read that in 2015, and I'm pretty sure the 4th book will come out in 2015. I love this. So this is about Selena Sardathian, and she's in prison for the fact that she was an assassin. Well, she's still an assassin. Then she gets rescued to compete in this tournament, and the winner gets to be the king's champion. And what that entails is they basically have to do the king's dirty work. So if you want somebody killed, the king's champion will do that. I love this so much. I loved all the characters. I loved Selena. I loved Kale, if that's how you pronounce his name. I loved Dorian. Moving on to 2015. And 2015 is actually when A Court of Thorns and Roses came out. And I actually read that one pretty soon after it came out. So it came out on, which is a funny date, which is a beautiful date, on 5/5/2015. So it came out on May 5th of 2015. And I read it on May 22nd of 2015, and I finished it on June 29th of 2015. And I remember really loving it. I fell in love with Tamlin in this book, even though obviously it's not a secret that he's not going to be the main love interest in this story. I didn't see any red flags in this story. I really fell in love with this book. I'm here to do my June wrap-up. I finished A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J Maas. I gave this book a 5 out of 5 stars. Of course, I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. I love her writing. I love her characters. This book has especially amazing characters. So this is basically about a world where fairies exist, and this is about a human named Feyre. And she kills a fairy, and one of his friends comes and collects her, and she has to live with him. And this is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, so you're kind of already guessing where this story will go. I very much enjoyed it. I loved Feyre. I loved Tamlin, who was the love interest in this book. And this is a new adult book, so it's a little bit more steamier than her other series, which is the Throne of Glass series. Like I said, really enjoyed it and very much looking forward to any other installments of this series. And then I read Heir of Fire. I started this on August 3rd and I finished it on September 5th. This one, I remember really struggling to get through this because I didn't really love Manon's chapters when I first read Heir of Fire, which I think that is not an unpopular opinion. I remember a lot of people who first read this book were struggling because of, well, first of all, she was in a completely different place. And also, like I said, Manon's parts, even though she's one of my favorite characters now, we didn't know her back then, so I just wasn't enjoying it that much. So the first book I finished was Heir of Fire by Sarah J. Maas. It's the third book in the Throne of Glass series, and if you didn't know, it's one of my favorite series of all time. I absolutely love it. And this book did not disappoint. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. I'm currently actually reading Queen of Shadows, which I'm also loving. I'm telling you guys, if you haven't started Throne of Glass yet, please do, because it's an amazing series. I love the main character. I love pretty much all of the characters, except one storyline, one perspective I don't enjoy as much. And if you've read it, then I know that you know which perspective I mean. Even those storylines were still great, it's just I prefer other ones. Having said that, I absolutely loved it. I'm loving Queen of Shadows, FYI. So this week's topic is your least favorite books in your favorite book series. Before I get started though, I do want to tell you guys the fact that these books are my least favorite in my favorite series doesn't mean that I hate them. In fact, I think the lowest rating out of all these books is a 4 out of 5 stars. I absolutely love all of these books. The fact that they're my least favorite books in a favorite series means that they're still leagues better than other books in my opinion. But some things that happened in the books made them my least favorite in a series, and that's bound to happen. Heir of Fire by Sarah J. Maas, and if you've watched my channel for a while, then you know how much I love the Throne of Glass series by Sarah J. Maas. This one is my least favorite. Having said that, like, there are still 2 more books that have yet to come out in this series, so that might change in the future. A couple of reasons why it's my least favorite. The same with Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. I still gave this a 5 out of 5 stars. It's obviously a part of my favorite series of all time. I didn't really like the location. So they went to another location and I thought that it slowed the story down a whole lot. Plus we got a new perspective, and in this book I didn't enjoy that perspective whatsoever. We also got that perspective in Queen of Shadows, which is the 4th book, and I started to really like that perspective in that book, but in this one I wasn't enjoying it. So yes, that's why it's my least favorite. And then Queen of Shadows came out, and this is the first Throne of Glass book that I read right after it came out. So this one came out on September 1st of 2015, and I read it on September 5th of 2014, and I finished it actually on December 29th of 2015. So it did take me over 3 months to read. I don't know why. Even on my rereads now, it doesn't take me that long to read. This is one of my favorite books in the series. I really love it. Queen of Shadows by Sarah J. Maas. This book was so good. Oh my god, I can't even. So this is, of course, the 4th book in the Throne of Glass series by Sarah J. Maas, which means I can't really tell you a whole lot about it. This book was so good. Heir of Fire I really liked, but I enjoyed this one a little bit more. So there's this new love thing developing, and I don't want to say too much about it, but if you've read this book, then you know what and who I'm talking about, and I absolutely love that. I'm totally digging that. I'm totally shipping them. So good. I loved that we got to see a character that we haven't seen before. We've only seen her in the novellas, and now we see her as an adult. I love that we got to see her, and yeah, it was such a good book. So good. And I cannot wait to read the 5th one, and it's gonna be a while before that one comes out, of course. So I definitely enjoyed this one. I, of course, gave this book a 5 out of 5 stars. And 2015 had, like, I read some good Sarah J. Maas books. Like, these 2 were amazing. I don't remember, but I guess you'll see because I'm gonna put the clip in here. I'm pretty sure this one was higher on my favorites list than this one. I think.
This video, I'll be telling you guys about my favorite books I've read in 2015. So this will be a top 10 video. My number 10 favorite book I read in 2015 is A Court of Thorns and Roses. This is not the only Sarah J. Maas book in this video. So I obviously gave this book a 5 out of 5 stars. I absolutely loved it. So this book is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, and it's about a girl named Feyre. And one day she shoots and kills a wolf, but that wolf turns out to be a fairy. So another fairy comes to her house, and as punishment she has to go and live with him in the fairy world. And a love story develops, and it's so good. I love the main character. I love the love interest. I pretty much loved everything about this book. I loved the fairy world. So definitely check this out if you haven't already. And it is part of a series, and the second book comes out in 2016. My number 5 favorite book is another Sarah J. Maas book, and it's Heir of Fire. And I finished Heir of Fire in August. Absolutely loved it, of course. I love this series. I love the characters, even though this is on my list of favorite books and it's a number 5, so that is very high. I do have to say that this was my least favorite Throne of Glass book I read. I loved all the others a little bit more than this one. Having said that, it's still on my list. It's still high up on my list. So I did love it. Like, my least favorite Throne of Glass book is still one of my favorite books I've read. Definitely love this series. And there's another book on this list that's also from this series. Number 4 favorite book is another Sarah J. Maas book, and this is the other Throne of Glass book I was talking about. And it's Queen of Shadows by Sarah J. Maas, and this is the 4th book in the Throne of Glass series. And since I already talked about the series, I'm not really going to talk about it right now. Like, I talked about it in Heir of Fire when I was talking about Heir of Fire. I love this book a little bit more than Heir of Fire. I liked where the characters were in this book. I liked how... I don't really want to spoil it, so I'm not going to really talk a whole lot about it. Just know that I loved it. I loved it so much, and I cannot believe there's only going to be 2 more books of Throne of Glass before the series is over. Like, I know I still have 2 more books and 2 more years, but I'm going to be an emotional wreck once the series is over because it is one of my favorite series.
Now, 2016, however, was an amazing year for Sarah J. Maas because, of course, A Court of Mist and Fury came out. Which is funny. I have a funny story about this because right around when this came out, The Raven King came out. And I remember debating, should I pick up this one first or The Raven King? And I ended up, of course, going for this one. And because of that decision, it took me, like, I never picked up The Raven King until like years later when I actually had to reread the first 3 books. So that is funny. The Raven King, I'm talking about the Raven Cycle by Maggie C. Potter. Anyway, the reason I had to choose between them is because I was going on vacation to Greece with my parents and I had to pick one because this already is ginormous. I couldn't take another book with me. So this one came out on May 3rd of 2016 and I started it on May 6th of 2016 and I finished it on July 14th of 2016. I remember the first part, it took me a while to get through because obviously I was already in love with Tamlin back then. Or it wasn't that I was in love with him, but I just thought that she was going to end up with Tamlin. Even though I was intrigued by Rhysand. But then, of course, this I fell in love with and I haven't looked back since.
The next book I finished was A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas, and this is the 2nd book in A Court of Thorns and Roses series. I actually really liked the first book, and I also love this one. I actually love this one more than the first book. Loved how the story developed, loved the new characters that were introduced, loved Rhysand, of course. Definitely would recommend this to you also, but I'm a big fan of Sarah J. Maas. I love her Throne of Glass series, and I also love the Court of Thorns and Roses series. This book was definitely better than the first one. If you didn't love the first one as much, I would still recommend you pick this up and see if you like this more, because I know a lot of people who didn't like the first book actually love this one. So yeah, keep in mind this is a very big book though, so definitely take your time to read it. But of course I loved it and I cannot wait for the 3rd book, which I'm assuming comes out next year.
I'm here to talk about my top 10 favorite fictional couples. Next is another recent one, but I definitely think this one will stick. It's Rhysand and Feyre from A Court of Thorns and Roses series. So in the first book, it was kind of implied that there would be some sort of love triangle. Like, I don't really think this book had a love triangle, to be honest. Yeah, there are 2 guys, but it was never her having to choose between two people. It was always one or the other. And I definitely love the fact that she chose Rhysand, because Rhysand is like the sexiest person ever. Once again, I just really loved how their relationship grew. I love how there was definitely some obstacles, but they definitely overcame that. I just really love them as a couple. And to be honest, even though A Court of Mist and Fury was a huge book, I just would have loved to read more about their relationship. If you don't know, Court of Mist and Fury is definitely very explicit in its sexual content, and I know some people didn't love that, but I loved it so much. Like, I was all about it, and I just like, I kind of want to reread their love story, like just flip through the pages of when they, you know, started really liking each other and then loving each other, and it was just perfection. I really am in love with their, like, with Rhysand and Feyre. I both love the characters separately, but I love them together as well. And pretty much all of the characters, not all of the characters, but a lot of the characters in A Court of Thorns and Roses series are amazing. And then 2016, another big release was Empire of Storms. This one I started on September 6th of 2016 and I finished it on December 31st of 2016, so right at the very end of the year. Like I said, it's just like really weird to me how some, like, we'll get to that, but Kingdom of Ash, which is longer than this one, took me way less to read. Like, I believe I read that book in 2 days, whereas this one also took me like 3 or 4 months to finish. And even like, I reread this last year and it definitely didn't take me 4 months to read. And the last book I finally finished, it took me, I started it in September. I started it when it came out and I finished it at the end of December. And it's Empire of Storms by Sarah J. Maas. Please don't ask me why it took me so long to finish. I don't know what it is about Sarah J. Maas books. Maybe because I want to savor them and not read them so fast. It always takes me so long to finish her books, but I loved it. I ended up giving it a 5 out of 5 stars. I actually was debating whether or not I wanted to lower the rating because it took me so long, and then I just realized it takes me so long because I kind of want to savor it. I don't want to finish it all at once, and that's fine too. I know some people have issues with it, and I kind of get why, but it didn't bother me as much as it bothered other people. There are some characters missing here which make me sad, honestly, but on the other hand, I did like the fact that we got to know some other characters, some new characters better, and maybe we wouldn't have had that if other people were still in this book. I do hope we get to see them in the last book since they are very important characters. And as far as the romantic department is concerned, I know a lot of people have issues with the fact that there are so many relationships, so many heterosexual relationships, which I get, honestly. The fact that they were so many did kind of bother me. It was like, okay, so does everybody have to be a couple in this book? But on the other hand, I don't know, like, it didn't bother me as much as it did other people. Once again, like, I do understand why it could bother some other people. It just didn't bother me, and that's just my opinion. The Throne of Glass series is definitely one of my favorite series. This one, to me, at least, it did not disappoint, and I very much look forward to reading the last book. One thing I do regret is not rereading the other books before reading this one, so I'm definitely gonna make it an effort to reread all of the books in 2017 before the last book comes out, because I do think that's very important. And I'm here to talk about my top 10 favorite books of 2016, and my number 1 favorite book I read in 2016 is probably one that's gonna be on a lot of people's top 10 favorite books of 2016, and it's A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas. This is the sequel to A Court of Thorns and Roses. This book was amazing. I loved it so much. I feel like this book was leagues better than the first one. The characters have definitely grown a lot. Most of the characters. I loved everything about this book. I loved the love story so much. It was so swoon-worthy. I loved it so much. This was definitely my favorite book I read all year. Moving on to 2017, A Court of Wings and Ruin came out. It took me 2 days to read this one. So I started it on May 2nd of 2017 and I finished it on May 3rd of 2017. By this point, you can see that I just fly through her books. I want to read them. I want to finish them as soon as possible. I definitely want to avoid spoilers at this point. And seeing all this does make me sad because it takes her way longer to finish books these days, because as you can see in 2016, she put out 2 big releases and they're also very long books. Whereas now sometimes it takes her 2 years to finish a book. But I mean, obviously her life is different now too. I believe she has 2 kids now, so. A Court of Wings and Ruin by Sarah J. Maas. This is the 3rd book in A Court of Thorns and Roses series, but this definitely was the conclusion to the first arc of the series. I gave this book a 5 out of 5 stars. A Court of Thorns and Roses is one of my favorite series. I have to say the second one is definitely my favorite. This one comes at a close second. I thought it was a good conclusion to like the first arc of the series, but it left a lot of questions open because the series is not finished. There are more books to be released. I'm here to talk about my favorite books I read in 2017. Court of Wings and Ruin. I really liked it. I like the way this story concluded, although I know that there's gonna be a novella out that also follows Rhysand and Feyre, because this is like that kind of the end of their story, and then the next actual book in the series is gonna follow a different character. It has been a while since I read this book, so I don't really know all of my thoughts. Love these characters. I'm so glad that we can read more about these characters. But what really stood out to me in this book was not really Rhysand and Feyre, like that. Like I felt like A Court of Mist and Fury was really their book. What I really loved about this book was actually getting to know the other characters more, which is understandable because obviously the next books are going to be from their perspectives. I really liked getting to know the other characters more and more. And I just really, really like this book. 2017, I only read one book. And that is because Tower of Dawn came out in 2017. And Chaol is just not one of my favorite characters, and I'm pretty sure I was in a reading slump around the time that book came out. So I actually never picked it up when it came out. I actually waited to read it until Kingdom of Ash came out. It's funny because this one came out on September 5th of 2017, and I started it on October 19th of 2018. I really thought that I was going to finish it before Kingdom of Ash came out, but I didn't. So I read a good portion of this, like I got over halfway through, I'm pretty sure. And then I just put it down when Kingdom of Ash came out. And then after I finished Kingdom of Ash, I went back and finished this one. So I started it on October 19th and I finished it on October 31st. At that time, I already knew how the series was going to end, so I just took my time with the rest of it. I reread it last year and I did enjoy my reread of it more than I did the first time reading it because, like I said, since I chopped it up in half and I wasn't really that into it because Chaol was not one of my favorite characters. Now on reread, I did enjoy it. And now I think the next time I'm going to reread this series, I'm definitely going to do a tandem read with Empire of Storms. You can just look up tandem read Throne of Glass because these obviously take place at around the same time, and I think I'm gonna definitely enjoy that experience. I don't know, but I definitely want to experience it that way. That is what I'm gonna do the next time I'm rereading this series. So of course, now we have to talk about Kingdom of Ash, which came out on October 23rd of 2018, and I started it on that day and finished it on October 25th. So this almost 1,000-page book I read in 3 days, and I have no regrets. Although, having said that, I'm currently rereading this book, and it's taking me so very long to finish it because since I'm reading a lot of other books while reading this one, I'm not really making it a priority, so I'm just like reading 30 pages here and there. But I am enjoying my reread of it. It's the first time I'm rereading it, but it's taking me way longer than the 3 days it took me to first read this book. And this is the first and only ending of a series that she's done. And yeah, by that time, I was reading her for 4 years. So now for the series, I'm pretty sure you can guess which series I'm talking about. So these are all the books I read this month of the Throne of Glass series. 3 of them were rereads and 2 of them weren't. So then I read finally Tower of Dawn, which I never read. I don't know why I didn't read it. Well, I do know why, because Chaol's not my favorite character. I do have to say, this book really made me love Chaol more, and I love everyone we got to meet in this book. I loved reading Kingdom of Ash right after and seeing everything we learned in this book come to, I guess, fruition in Kingdom of Ash. Yeah, I definitely did enjoy myself. And then last but not least is Kingdom of Ash, obviously. So this is the final book in the Throne of Glass series. I definitely like the way she ended it. This is almost 1,000 pages, which I appreciated because I wanted to spend as much time as I could with all these characters. It was bittersweet, obviously, saying goodbye to all these characters. This book did make me cry a couple of times. And yeah, for those of you who haven't started this series yet, I would highly recommend it. I thought it was a fun, action-packed series with lots of amazing characters that I will never forget. In 2019, I don't think she had a book come out. So moving on to 2020, where she started a new series. And I do remember before I picked up Crescent City. I was once again in a giant reading slump. I hadn't been reading for years, it felt like, but it was probably months. And then I saw this at the bookstore. I completely forgot that she had another book out. So I picked it up. I just flew through this book, even though the first part is very difficult to get through. But since I was in a reading slump before picking this book up, I just flew through it because I do enjoy her writing. So I started this on March 24th of 2020 and I finished it on March 29th of 2020. And I do remember really loving it. I do have to say Crescent City is my least favorite series by her. But I do remember flying through it and being very excited that I was out of my reading slump because of this book.
So this week's topic is your worst love interests. Some of these I think a lot of you can agree with me on, but I know that there are some controversial ones. I know some of these a lot of people really love. Well, there's one I'm really scared of, but you know, I always want to be honest with you guys. Actually, the most controversial one is the one I'll mention first. So these will be ranked. The person I'll mention last is my worst love interest. The person I mentioned first is not the worst, I guess. So, number 5 on my list, it's a person from the Throne of Glass series, and can you guess? I picked Kill Westfall. I know a lot of people are like in love with him. I unfortunately am not one of those people. In fact, I think he is Selena's worst love interest. Like, I prefer all her other love interests over Kale. Like, all of them. Dorian, Sam, Rowan. Like, I like all of them more than Kale. I find Kale to be boring. And also, his character development has gotten worse over the books, and I don't think that's fair for Sarah J. Maas, because I know a lot of people love him, and I know he gets kind of annoying in Heir of Fire, but especially Queen of Shadows. But having said that, the first time I read about him, which was in Throne of Glass, he wasn't my favorite. Like, I preferred Dorian over him. Like, the thing with Kale is I get why people like him, but his personality isn't like a personality I like in guys, and that's really what I look for in my love interests, like even in my character's love interests. But having said that, I do think that for Selena, he's also not really the right person for her, but like I said, that's just my opinion.
Then 2021 came around, and so A Court of Frost and Starlight I never picked up because I just heard so many not good things about it, and I wasn't that interested to pick it up back when it came out, which was in 2018. But then when A Court of Silver Flames came out, I just picked this one up before that because people said that this was definitely a bridge book between, if you were gonna read it, just see it as a bridge book between the Rhys and Feyre books and then the other books. So I did read it. And I read it, like I said, right before Court of Silver Flames came out. So I started it on February 2nd of 2021 and I finished it on February 4th of 2021. I enjoyed it. It was a 4-star. It's nothing, like, I don't think this is necessary at all. But it's Sarah J. Maas and I am going to read everything this woman writes. And then, of course, I picked up A Court of Silver Flames and I started it on February 16th of 2021 and I finished it on February 19th of 2021. And this is one of the few books where once I finished it, I went right back around and picked it up again and reread it. But the second time I read it, I definitely took my time. I believe it took me 3 months to do my reread, but I was definitely savoring it. I do have to say, with the Throne of Glass series, because I was reading them as they came out, I, just like everybody else, was under the impression that it was just going to be a trilogy. It was just going to be about Rhys and Feyre, and it was just going to be that. When she announced that she was going to continue on with the series, since I'm such a completionist, once I already accepted in my mind that a series is going to be like 3 books, I find it very difficult when an author says they're going to continue on. It's very hard for me to get on board because it feels like a cash grab. I also feel like it's not necessary usually. So I was kind of reluctant picking this book up, even though I do obviously love Cassian and I did think that Nesta was an interesting character. But once I picked it up, I did definitely fall in love with this book. I do have to say the plot for this one is weaker than the other Court of Thorns and Roses books, in my opinion. But I did really love this book so much. And this one I read right around the time I really, really got into romance. like not just fantasy romance, but other types of romances. So obviously the whole, like all the smutty scenes in here, I was just eating up, and I was definitely loving them. My next 4-star read was A Court of Frost and Starlight by Sarah J Maas. This is my first time reading this book. I've never read it when it came out. I don't know why. So this is basically the 3.5 novel in her Court of Thorns and Roses series. And I read this in anticipation for A Court of Silver Flames. This book really doesn't have any plot. It's basically just following our favorite characters around. I probably wouldn't have loved this book if it was any other author, but since I love Sarah J Maas so much, I love these characters so much, I did really like it. Like before I read A Court of Silver Flames, I would have said that you don't need to read this one to read A Court of Silver Flames. However, a surprising amount of plot points from this book definitely did come back in A Court of Silver Flames. So if you love A Court of Thorns and Roses and you haven't started A Court of Silver Flames and you're debating, I would say definitely read it. Don't buy the hardback though, because I don't think it's worth that price. But if you can find a paperback or if you can find it on ebook, definitely read it. Like I said, it doesn't have any plot. So was it necessary? No. But I did like some things that were interwoven from this book into A Court of Silver Flames. And I just like these characters. Like I would follow them around doing anything and I would still love it. Your enjoyment level of this book will definitely vary based on how much you love this series and on how much you love this author. Since I really love this series and love Sarah J Maas, I gave it 4 stars, but I definitely couldn't justify giving it a 5-star considering there was no plot. And my favorite book I read in February should come as no surprise. It's obviously A Court of Silver Flames by Sarah J Maas. I already told you she's my favorite author. This is my favorite book I read this year so far. I adored this book. So this is the 4th book in the Court of Thorns and Roses series. And basically the first 3 books follow Feyre, and then the next couple of books are like standalone romances in this world. This book follows Cassian and Nesta. I cannot tell you a whole lot about it considering it's the 4th book in a series. This might actually be one of my favorite Sarah J Maas books. In fact, after I finished it, I already immediately started rereading it again. I'm on page 168. I'm probably gonna finish it this month, talk about it again next month. But I really loved it. I loved the character development. I loved the romance in this book because, you know, Nesta is a very unlikable character, and I did definitely not really like her in the first couple of... I started warming up to her in the 3rd book, but I didn't like her in A Court of Frost and Starlight, and I didn't like her in the first 2 books. But this book was so good. I loved it so much. I loved her character development. I loved getting to know her. I loved Cassian, of course, but I've always loved Cassian. This was great. This is really like on par for me with A Court of Mist and Fury. Like both don't really focus a whole lot on plot because there is plot, but it's more in the background. Really focus on our main female character, her wounds, her traumas, her going through all that, and just her falling in love with this like amazing guy. I love this book. I will keep raving about it. This will definitely be in my favorite books of 2021. I loved it. And yeah, like I said, Sarah J Maas continues to be one of my favorite authors, and this book just proved to me how much I love her. I'm here to talk about all my favorite books of 2021 so far. I can't tell you which one is probably going to be my favorite book of the year, and out of all of these, it's this one I'm going to talk about, and it's A Court of Silver Flames by Sarah J Maas. So Sarah J Maas is my favorite author of all time. I've loved every single one of her books, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. This book moved me so much. I loved it. I tabbed it up, although not this edition. I tabbed my original edition to save those asking. This is the Illumicrate dust jacket, so it's gorgeous. This is obviously Cassian and Nesta's story, and I love Cassian. I've always loved Cassian, and I loved reading his story. Nesta, I know a lot of people hated Nesta. I never really hated her, so I was always on board with her story, and I loved her in this book. This book moved me to tears. It was very hot, and I really loved it. I don't know what else there is to say, because if after all these years you haven't been convinced to read A Court of Thorns and Roses, I don't know what I can say to convince you. I loved it. I knew I would. I do have to say, like, I'm very biased. Obviously, I know these characters. I can definitely see if I don't know why you would, but if you just read this book without having read all the others, you might see some flaws. Even though I still love this book, I can definitely see some flaws. But to me, this is so character driven that the plot takes a backseat, and that's fine to me. I can definitely acknowledge that the plot is not the best thing out there, but that's not why I read these books. I read these books for the characters, and Sarah J. Maas, as always, does not disappoint. And then we're gonna skip 2 years, because when House of Sky and Breath came out, I do remember I was in Italy with a friend of mine, and I downloaded that book on my e-reader, and I, for the life of me, could not get into this book. And then it took me years, and I just never picked it up. The plan was to read House of Sky and Breath in 2023. I just never got around to it. So I actually ended up picking it up right before House of Flame and Shadow came out. So this one actually came out on February 15th of 2022, but I started it on January 1st of 2024, and I finished it on January 20th of 2024. A part of me is sad that I never read it when it came out, because it probably would have been my favorite book I read that year, or one of my favorite books I read that year. And now I do find it difficult to see this as on its own, as opposed to reading it before reading House of Flame and Shadow. And between the two, I do prefer House of Flame and Shadow. But a part of me is glad, because obviously this ends on a big cliffhanger, and now I only had to wait like a week to continue on. And the last 5-star was actually House of Sky and Breath by Sarah J. Maas. So this was actually the first time I read this book. I never read it when it came out because I was in a huge reading slump. And it's funny, I don't know what it is about Sarah's books, even though they are compulsively readable to me, and her chapters are pretty short, so I get through them very fast. Also, House of Flame and Shadow, which I'm currently reading, that combined with real life things also put me in a reading slump. And I don't understand why, because I love her book. She's my favorite author. Moving on, House of Sky and Breath is the second book in the Crescent City series. I cannot tell you a whole lot about it because obviously I don't want to spoil that series. You follow Bryce Quinlan, who's a half-human, half-fae girl, and her love story with Hunt, who's a fallen angel. We also follow other characters. Sarah always has this whole cast of characters. And this book, what I really, really loved was Rune, Bryce's brother, and I loved his romance in this book. Like, it was perfect to me. It was so good. I already had a soft spot for Rune in the first book because I felt like Bryce did not treat him well at all. I feel like she was so unfair to him, even though he was one of my favorite characters. So I did really love his character progression in here. And I really loved like the real found family that developed in this book. I love it. I love Sarah J. Maas's books. Crescent City is not my favorite series. Maybe it will in the future. But like I said, I love Sarah J. Maas. I love her books. I love her writing. She's my favorite author, and I'm not ashamed of that at all, and I don't think anybody should be. And then, of course, last but not least, I read House of Flame and Shadow, and this one I started on January 30th of 2024, and I finished it on February 14th of 2024. This is actually funny because I took the day off the day it came out. So I actually read, like on the first day, I read like 400 pages of it. But for my job, sometimes we have to go to a different city and we have to sleep there, and we have to also work through the night. I believe this one came out on a Tuesday, I think. And then Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, I barely had any time to read because I had to just work. Which, I mean, that is one of my favorite things to do for my job. But it's obviously almost impossible to read. So that's why it took me longer. Like the second half took me way longer than the first half to read, because like I said, like the first half I read in a day, and then the other half I read in like 2 weeks. House of Flame and Shadow by Sarah J. Maas. So this is the third book in her Crescent City series. And this, okay, so when this came out was a really weird week for me where I wasn't home a lot. So I actually took the day off when this came out, which was on January 30th. And I actually read like half of this book on that day. But then I had to travel to a different city for work. And we had to work pretty long hours, and I was constantly with colleagues. I spent the night at my parents' house, and then that weekend we had like a weekend getaway with colleagues. So I had a lot of social things going on, which meant that I didn't have a whole lot of time to read, which means that I like read half of this in one day, and then the other half, it took me about 2 weeks to read. Not just because of the social things. Also, I got a little bit slumpy, I think, because of that. Having said all that, I really love this book. I gave it 5 stars. It was so entertaining to me, this book. And I also really loved where this book left off. Obviously, without spoiling, this definitely finished an arc, which I like. Obviously, I never really love it when a book ends on a cliffhanger. I'm pretty sure we're getting the next ACOTAR book and not the next Crescent City book. So I like the fact that this ended where it did, so that it is fine that we have to wait probably 2 or maybe 3 years for the sequel. I enjoyed it. I know there are some criticisms. I do have to say I've not heard those criticisms yet, but I have seen like thumbnails of people not enjoying this book. I, however, did really love it. I thought it was very fast paced, even though this was over 800 pages. I thought that it was action packed. While I was reading it, it was pretty hard for me to put down. So yeah, I gave it 5 stars. Obviously, it's Sarah J. Maas. I'm pretty sure I've given every single book she's ever written 5 stars. Well, maybe not A Court of Frost and Starlight, but other than that, 5 stars across the board, and this has not changed that at all. So I'm not gonna hold all of these books up, but those were the 16 books I read by Sarah J. Maas in the decade that I have been reading her. I have reread a lot of these books, like the Throne of Glass series, except for the last 2 books. I have reread that series 3 times already. I'm gonna keep reading her as long as she keeps writing, so I'm gonna read her for the next decade to come and the decade after that. The only book by her that I have not read yet is Catwoman. This one came out, let's see, in 2018, and it's actually a special edition that I believe I got from Illumicrate. I just have not read this yet. I'm kind of saving it for a rainy day. Also, I don't know what people's thoughts are about this book, but since it is Sarah J. Maas, I do want to read it eventually. My least favorite book by her is A Court of Frost and Starlight. This is just not my favorite. I do think this is not necessary. I believe it's the only one I gave 4 stars. It's fine. And then my favorite series by her is the Throne of Glass series. I just really love that series. I love all the characters. I love the ensemble cast. I love the main character. I know a lot of people don't, but I really do love Aelin. And Dorian is one of my favorite characters of all time, and I really love him, and I love like the character development that he went through. It's very sad, but also such an interesting character development. But my favorite book of Sarah J. Maas, but also one of my favorite books of all time, is of course A Court of Mist and Fury. This is a masterpiece in my opinion. It is perfect. Rhysand is one of my favorite characters of all time, and I just really, this is so special for me because, like I said, I read it while it was coming out. So I didn't know anything about it before. I didn't know we were supposed to hate Tamlin. I didn't know that Rhysand was going to be her fated mate. I didn't know any of that. So I was going along for the ride, and I just felt everything that she felt. Like when she fell in love with Tamlin, I fell in love with him. And then when she fell out of love with him, I fell out of love with him. And when she finally fell in love with Rhysand, I fell in love with him head over heels. And I just haven't looked back since. And this is just, like I said, this is a masterpiece in my opinion. Obviously, people are fine to have their opinions, and every opinion is valid. It's just this book, when people say they hate Sarah J. Maas, I question whether or not they read A Court of Mist and Fury, because I truly cannot understand how somebody could hate this. But of course, there are some people and their opinions are valid. It's just, I really, really love this book. And if I didn't have any other book to read, I would probably reread this book for the rest of my life, every single day. I do have to say, I haven't reread this book a lot. I think I'm just savoring it. I don't want to ruin other books for myself if I constantly keep rereading this. This week's topic, which is series where you thought the second book was the best. And now for my number 1, and I do think that this is gonna be a lot of people's number 1, and it's A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas. Now, I know the first book, A Court of Thorns and Roses, was a book that a lot of people really divided on. A lot of people actually hated that book. Now, I wasn't one of those people. I actually liked the book. Was it my favorite book of all time? No, but obviously I like Sarah J. Maas as an author. I like her writing style. I like her characters. I obviously do think that she's not perfect as an author, but I have definitely enjoyed her books a lot. But that was before I read A Court of Mist and Fury. Like, A Court of Mist and Fury made me realize that A Court of Thorns and Roses wasn't a great book, because this one was. This one, once again, I fell head over heels in love with. And even though it's big, and even though it took me a long time to read it, I enjoyed everything about it. And obviously fell in love with the characters once again. Like, even Feyre, who we got to know in the first book, I liked her more in this book. Obviously, we met some amazing characters in this book who I absolutely love. So I definitely think that this book was definitely the turning point for the trilogy. I know a lot of people who disliked the first book loved this one. This week's topic was characters you used to love but don't anymore. Actually, 2 Sarah J. Maas characters. So I'm gonna just give you a little bit to decide which characters I might be talking about. One is from Throne of Glass and one is from A Court of Thorns and Roses. So let's see. You know what? Why don't you leave in the comments below which characters you think I will choose. So the first one is the Court of Thorns and Roses one, and I chose Tamlin, which I don't think is going to be a big surprise. With Tamlin, I know some people didn't like him from the beginning, said that he was very controlling. And in the first book, I actually did like him. And the whole controlling aspect, since it was a Beauty and the Beast retelling, I didn't mind that aspect, like, at all. Like, I didn't hold it against him because it was a Beauty and the Beast retelling. And if you don't know, Beauty and the Beast is pretty much about Stockholm Syndrome, essentially. Obviously, I know, like, the Beast turns out to be a good guy. I realize that, but he is very controlling in the beginning. So I was like, okay, that fits with the whole Beast character. And then I read the second book, and honestly, I obviously Resend was a thing and was like a real legitimate thing. And Tamlin became more and more abusive, more and more controlling. And what I felt like, as much as the whole controlling aspect made a little bit of sense in the first book, simply because, I'm not gonna spoil it, but if you read it, then you know what I mean. Like, say, Feyre's situation, the way Feyre was. And like, even then, like, the way Feyre was, he still gave her more freedom in the first book than in the second book. Whereas in the second book, Feyre is a completely different person. And like I said, I don't want to spoil it, but if you read it, then you know what I mean, you know, after what happened at the end of A Court of Thorns and Roses. So I feel like he shouldn't have been this controlling, yet he was. In fact, he was even more controlling than A Court of Thorns and Roses, and it didn't make sense to me. Like, that's the big difference. In the first book, it did make a little bit of sense, but in the second book, it made no sense whatsoever, and I just don't like him anymore. I used to actually love him. I really fell in love with him in the first book, and now I hate him. I'm actually very interested to see what they're going to do with his character in the third book, because, like I said, if you read the book, then you know where, you know, everybody is now. So very interested to see what's going to come of Tamlin. And last but not least is a character from Throne of Glass. And I know some of you might guess Cale, but I didn't choose Cale because the thing with Cale is I liked him. He was never my favorite character. In fact, if you watch my least favorite love interest, I think that was another top 5 Wednesday video. I'll leave it on the screen as well as down below. He was never my favorite love interest for Selena. I know a lot of people love him. I was not one of them. The person I'm choosing right now is actually Dorian. The thing with Dorian is I still really like him. Like, I think he's a very likable character, and I hope the best. I want the best for him, and I really love him. The thing is, I used to be in love with him. Like, I really wanted him. I thought he was a great character. I thought he was, like, one of my favorite male characters. He was one of my favorite, like, book boyfriends. And I think, like, around Era Fire, not even Era Fire, I think Queen of Shadows. No, you know what? It's not even Queen of Shadows. It's like the end of Queen of Shadows, beginning of Empire of Storms, that he just became like, okay, Dorian is here. It's not like, I feel like I just became a little bit indifferent to him. Like, I used to be in love with him, and now I'm like, okay, so Dorian is back. Like, I don't know. I think he lost some of his charm for me. Of course, he went through a lot, but I don't know. I feel like as the other characters began shining, I think he shone a little bit less. I don't know if that makes a whole lot of sense, but I feel like especially in the first few books, he was definitely a light. He was definitely a very present character, and now he's just there. Like, and I don't mean light, like, okay, he used to be really funny and now he's not anymore, because of course, a lot of things happened to him, a lot of horrible things happened to him, so I definitely understand that aspect. But once again, I feel like since more and more characters have joined the group, he became less and less, I really don't know how to explain this, like, he just became somebody that was just there. I don't know if that makes a whole lot of sense. Definitely leave it in the comments below if that explanation just confused you, or if you know exactly what I mean. Definitely in the comments below. So I'm currently editing this vlog, and at this point I just put like random clips in here of me obviously praising the books and the series and the characters, and some where I have some criticisms. I did want to insert a clip here after this one. Obviously, I do still stand by the Tamlin characterization. I don't, however, stand with the Dorian characterization. I can understand my feelings at this point because this was in 2016. I was still reading the books. And obviously by this point we got introduced to Manon, Lysandra came back, Rowan was obviously a very big character. So I do understand why Dorian felt like a little bit of a throwaway character at this point, especially because he was so prominent in the first couple of books. And obviously he used to be like one of my favorite characters. Well, I used to be my favorite character. Like I wanted Selena to end up with him. Now, however, after reading the entire series and also on my rereads, Dorian has solidified himself as one of my favorite Throne of Glass characters, one of my favorite Sarah J. Maas characters, and just one of my favorite characters of all time. He's also one of my favorite love interests of all time. In fact, he is like one of my book boyfriends. I made a video on that not too long ago, which I'll leave linked for you. I just like his entire arc. Like I love how he starts off as a funny character who doesn't have a care in the world, but with like sometimes we see glimpses of him like really caring, even though his father is like one of the most awful beings of all time. Then obviously we see like him becoming so very, very tortured, and then ultimately we see him rise from the ashes. Even though I still stand by my thoughts back then. I do think that I was telling the truth, obviously. But now in hindsight and looking back and having read every single book in the series, which I hadn't done at that point because not every book was out yet. And also rereading the entire series, which I also hadn't done at that point because the first time I think I reread the series was before Kingdom of Ash came out, which was like in 2018. I can say wholeheartedly that Dorian is one of my favorite characters. So yeah, I did want to clarify my thoughts on that because I believe somewhere in this long video, you will hear me say that he's one of my favorite characters. So it's just like a little bit odd that for me in 2016, I'm telling you that I've fallen out of love with him.
This week's topic was your favorite villains. The King of Adderland in Throne of Glass, which I'm not going to say a whole lot about because I definitely don't want to spoil it. He's Dorian's father. He is such a despicable human being, such an awful father, such an awful leader, such an awful person. I hated him. Everything he did to other countries. And even if you don't take all that into consideration, everything he did to his son is awful enough. Like, I hated him so much. And while reading these books, I was like, I really want to kill you. You're so awful. So yeah, that's the King of Adderland. And last but not least is another Sarah J. Maas villain, and it's, I don't know how to pronounce this, but Amarantha or whatever, like, I don't know, but I hate her. Okay, everything she does, and especially this book, is just awful. And especially, like, towards the end of the book, everything she does, like, you think, okay, she can't get any worse, but then she does. Okay, she was such an awful person. I hated her so much. Like, I hated her with a passion. And then in book 2, you learn a lot of other things about her too. The things she did to Rhysand that we didn't even know about. Awful, awful, awfulness all around. She was such a despicable person. Like, I hated her so much. Like, every time I read her name, I got this, like, I got so angry. So definitely Sarah J. Maas does know how to write her villains. I'm here to talk about my favorite quotes. And last but not least are the Sarah J. Maas quotes. The first one is from Throne of Glass. Do you, like, I'm sensing a theme here. Most of my quotes are centered around books or words or reading. Like, those are the, because I can relate to them, of course, because I love reading so much. The first one is another quote about reading, and it's, "Libraries were full of ideas, perhaps the most dangerous and powerful of all weapons." The next one, also from Throne of Glass, "You could rattle the stars," she whispered. "You could do anything if only you dared, and deep down you know it too. That's what scares you the most." And last but most certainly not least is a Court of Mist and Fury quote, and it's, "To the people who look at the stars and wish, Rhys." Rhys clinked his glass against mine. "To the stars who listen and the dreams that are answered." So yes, that was my decade of reading Sarah J. Maas. I would really love to know in the comments below what you think of her. If you don't like her, that is fine too. You can definitely tell me in the comments below. I would prefer it if you were nice about it too, obviously, because she is one of my favorite authors. And for those of you who do love her, I would really love to know, how long have you been reading her? What is your favorite book by her? What is your least favorite book by her? Or if you have like any other thoughts you want to share about her with me,
leave all those thoughts in the comments below. And I would really love if you could leave me a blue heart emoji for A Court of Mist and Fury. And I really hope you enjoyed this video. Definitely let me know by leaving a like if you did. And thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.